Okay, I think we're going. Ryan, hello. How are
Hello.
you?
Good, how are you?
So I just noticed this when so you are just like me. So you have two first names, Ryan
I was
Austin.
thinking about that today, about you. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, Dustin Oliver. Can I
Yep.
ask what is your middle name?
William.
Get out. So my middle name is Miles.
Yeah.
So it's also, I have three first names.
Yep.
You weren't
Such
bullied
a
for that,
niche,
were you?
such a niche struggle. People don't think about it, but
Yeah, really, because I've gotten to where I don't know if Ryan experiences this. Maybe you get confused for Brian.
yeah.
Because obviously my name is Dustin. And so whenever I go places, people always call me Justin. So whenever I'm like
Right.
at Starbucks or if I'm somewhere where it involves taking a name, I just give my last name because there's been too
It's
many,
easier, yeah.
yeah, there's been too many times where it's like they say Justin and then I'm like, it's fine.
Yeah.
Just use my
My
last
new
name.
experience has been recently that I've noticed a lot is like people being like last name, I'll be like Austin, they'll be like last name, I'll be like Austin. Like
Hmm.
I heard you. I
They're
got
like, no, you're a fraud.
it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I totally relate to that. And I'm sorry for the struggle that you've had to experience that.
yeah. It's okay. It's why I do what I do today.
Yeah. So speaking of what you do today,
Yeah.
you are a licensed professional counselor. You're an
Mm,
LPC.
mm-hmm.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You are an icon, a legend, the moment.
Wow.
So we are right. We are. I want to talk a little bit about what you do, particularly IFS, which is internal family systems, which I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people already do, but do not know that they do.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'm really excited to talk to you about it because it is my favorite treatment modality.
Yeah.
Like
That's great to
absolute
hear.
favorite. I did it in my own personal therapy without knowing that that's what it was.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I later was like learning about like internal family systems and I was like, "Wait a minute. Like I've
Yeah.
experienced this."
Yeah.
So I'm excited to talk about that. First, I want to ask you a little bit about where you went to school, where are you
Mm-hmm.
practicing, or I mean, like what state are you in? Like what's going on? What's the
Yeah, yeah,
vibe?
yeah. Great. I went to the University of North Georgia for my master's. So my degree is in mental health counseling, a master's of science. Um, but then I got a specialization with my degree of addictions counseling. So I think it was like 12 hours. I think it was like three or four classes on substance use and like psychopharmacology and like addiction in society and stuff like that. And then I did through my school, my internship was at a community mental health practice building that the university owns. Only students who are in their internship and practicum are seeing clients there. So it's like a pro and con thing, but of you're getting a new counselor or they're learning, but they're also getting supervision, so it's not like you're just going buck wild. But then after a year, if you decide as a client, if you decide to stay, like you get a new counselor. So I think I had someone who had been there, I was like their fourth or fifth, and I think that's really cool. And it was like no payment, no insurance, like you come, like the only thing we ask is that you like make your appointments, because if you're not, that impacts hours. So I was doing a lot of like community mental health counseling, which I loved in up in rural Georgia. Um, and then since then, for the past 3 years, I've been in private practice. And then 2 of those years, I was also doing accountability court, which changes maybe by state, maybe by county, but in where I was working, it was if you had two DUI or possession charges within a 5 year period. And so you could plea into this program where you had to get a certain amount of work hours. You were doing individual and group. So I was running 2 2 hour groups a week and doing anywhere from 3 to 7 individuals at a time. Um, and now I'm just in private practice, hoping to start maybe a smart recovery or something, or do like a group, because I actually loved running groups. So I'm very in touch with my addictions roots. I did a fellowship in school through NBCC and NADAC, the Minority Addictions Fellowship. I was like a recipient. So I got to go to 2 or 3 symposiums or conferences and stuff like that, while I was also naming how I was providing services to an underserved or minority population.
That was an
Um,
undergrad?
that was all in my master's. Like,
Okay, okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Because I was thinking it was completely different. I just was like an RA for like an alcohol study. And that
Oh,
was
wow.
really interesting. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I we were measuring the effects of alcohol on intimate partner violence with same-sex couples.
Wow. Yes.
So
Okay,
that was,
cool.
yeah, that was really interesting. Um, that was interesting. That's all I'll say.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious about accountability core. I've never heard of that. Like,
Yes.
what is that?
So it's basically like I think they exist everywhere, but I don't know what it looks like from state to state or even county by county, because there are different counties. But it's accountability court is like the government's response to, I can never say this word right, recidivism rates of like people who are going back to jail for the same thing. And so it's like it's like tough. Like I had to do my own like reckoning with like, oh, I'm working with like police officers and like the government, but it's also like, hey, like you have had more than one DUI, you have gone to jail multiple times, like you have this possession charge, like, you have decided to be in this program for whatever reason. Sometimes people just do it to stay out of jail. But it's like through the court. So I think a lot of ours had to do like 30 something work hours a week and it had to be signed off. They were required to come to court how many times a month, depended on where they were in the program. They're getting drug tested randomly. They have to attend individual, they have to attend group, and this is where it's like the government and the criminal justice system is involved. It's like, a sanction could be you go to jail for 24 hours, but that was all depending on like how many sanctions, what did you not do or miss or whatever, and stuff like that. And so then there are phases. And so I was a part of a DUI and drug track and a veteran track. And then there's also like a family court track. So that one I don't know as much about, but it's, I think, like you have to do this program to kind of get your kids back. Otherwise, they might go into someone else's care permanently.
What was it like? What was your experience like working with that population?
I really loved it. I really miss it. Um, I think of it as, yes, I'm a part of this criminal justice system that I don't necessarily support, especially when we talk about addictions and trauma. And not that I'm the best, but at least I'm going to try my best to give really good services, and at least I care, and at least I'm going to align with you and try to, like, if you can care enough to try to do it, I'm going to care with you. I would tell them I'm not going to care more than you. I'm not going to try harder than you because that leads to burnout. But I really want you to succeed, and I believe that you can and should succeed and get something out of this. I think the minimum is like a year and a half or something like that. And the phases all look different. And by the last phase, there's not as much that they need to do, but it's still pretty, like, it's demanding. It's,
Mhm.
it's a lot. So
On
I
both of
describe it,
you, you mean?
yeah, and
Yeah.
I describe it as counseling and almost like case management, which they have a case manager, but it's like one guy was gonna go to jail and leave the program because I think it was he didn't have a job and he hadn't shown effort to try to get a new one. And so I came in and I was like, hey, I care for you, I want the best for you. He's like, yeah. And I said, so you know where this is coming from. You need to get your shit together. Um, and he did, and he did not go to jail.
Mhm.
So yeah, it was interesting. I actually really loved it. It was very formative to the counselor and person that I am today.
I love that.
Yeah.
I It's interesting. I did a small internship um, with an IOP, PHP IOP
Yeah.
in Alpharetta, actually,
Okay,
Georgia.
cool. Yep.
And a lot of the counselors themselves were in recovery. So it was really cool to see like that combination of like
Yeah.
when you say phrases like get your shit together, like it was really interesting to see that like clinically, like to kind of and
Yeah.
also it's like where, I think of that Tyra moment, where she's like, we're rooting for you.
You
We're
were
all
all
rooting
rooting
for
for
you.
you,
Yeah.
right? That is so, yeah,
Hmm.
that's what it's like working in the accountability court. And the difference between like IOP, PHP, and this is like this is a sentence. And that was like the really difficult thing of like they would complain and I'd be like, your complaints are valid. I get it. This was also what you plead into. Like, this is the alternative. And at least we want you in the society that we live in, do this program and be out of jail, be in jail. Let's try to be over here.
Yeah. Um, that's a good motivator, not going to jail.
Yeah, you would think. People went to jail.
Really?
Yeah. People left the program, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah.
So I want to like lightly shift, but not fully.
Yes,
So
that's fine.
internal family systems.
Yes.
So where did this come into play? Like, where did the interest, because I want to acknowledge like you just finished a certification, right?
Yeah, I got into a level 2 training. So I will be
Okay.
doing a level 2 training later this year.
Okay.
It's a compassionate approach to addictive processes. So,
Okay. So
yeah.
it's using the IFS model to treat addiction.
Yes.
Okay. So tell me about how this came into play.
Yeah.
Like I said, I love IFS. Actually, should we start? You know a little bit more than me about it, so I'm curious. Like, should we start on what it is?
Yeah, I mean, I can explain it the best that I can.
I have full confidence in you.
Yeah. So I think what has really helped popularize it is the Inside Out movies because those movies are like very strongly based on this type of theory. I think it was Frank Anderson. It may be someone else who helped like consult with the concept or script or something. So it's like if you've ever done IFS therapy and then you go watch their movies, you're like, wait, that's what this is. Several of my clients came in and they were like, is that this? And I was like, yes. I describe it, we use the parts language all the time. Well, a part of me really wants to forgive her, but a part of me is just so hurt, or a part of me wants to go out to eat tonight, and a part of me really wants to stay in and save money. And it is the idea and concept that those parts of you, um, they call it psychic multiplicity, subparts of your personality. We have all these different parts. I don't even know if I can put a number on it, and those parts are in charge or have jobs or do or hold specific emotions, and those jobs are born out of the way that we were raised. And IFS therapy is, I can say it's like trippy. It's like a trippy way for you to, I describe it as like having a one-on-one conversation with a part of yourself from a place where you have no parts. So it's called self. um, some of the traits are like compassion, calmness, like curiosity, connectedness, all the things. And on one side, if you're totally cognitive and, like head heavy, I describe it as like, this is the true state of being that your brain and every brain has the capacity to be. Some people are religious and spiritual and they're like self and self energy, and that state is religious or spiritual for them. And so I let my clients kind of decide what that is, but it's doing that to be like, why do I do or feel what I do? Where does this, a lot of times I describe it as like, what wound does this lead back to?
So when you say apart, right?
Yeah.
By the way, I have to acknowledge something. You did something I do all the time. I think it was unconscious. You did like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
I'm like,
Me
oh
with
my
my
God.
fresh haircut with no hair being like,
You're
so
like, you're
suck
like,
this piece.
yeah. I'm like this diva.
Yeah.
Um, so you mentioned something really interesting. So or sorry, going back, when we talk about like a different part, right? So if I say something like, a part of me doesn't like wants to go out to eat tonight, right?
Yeah.
And then a part of me really wants to stay home.
Yeah.
In therapy, when we're talking about like, all these terms and all this stuff, like how would we address that situation in therapy? Like maybe I could alter the scenario to say, I'm really mad that my friend said this thing.
Yeah.
And so a part of me really wants to confront my friend,
Yeah.
but a part of me really wants to let it go because we have a trip that we're going on next week.
Yeah.
So, in working like with parts work in like that scenario,
Yeah.
how could you use that scenario to kind of explain like how we would address like the different
Yeah.
parts?
I think, it's such a good like example because it's like surface level but relatable, right? Well, maybe the part of you that's really angry and wants to confront her was born from when you were young and you didn't feel like people listened to you, and they didn't feel like your emotions were valid. So your brain, your system, whatever, said, okay, well, if people aren't going to listen to me, I have to be really aggressive to make people listen to me. I have to do this because if I don't, I'm going to feel unheard. And if I don't feel heard, I'm going to feel lonely. I'm going to feel like I don't matter. And so this part's like, we should confront her. We should tell her because what we have to say matters. But then somebody may have a part that says, like you said, I don't want to do this. Maybe that part is born from like conflict was so much that this person learned to skate by in conflict in the home by not speaking up and just letting things lie. And their emotions aren't worth the potential conflict. And so, at the premise of parts work is that there are no bad parts, which is a book title of a book. It's like they're all working for you, and it's, you know, trying to accomplish something. So in therapy, I would do, with those two specifically coming up for a client, I would do something, it's called a polarization. So part of you feels the exact opposite of another part. And I call it a visualization exercise, though I think it's more than just visualization, where the client holds these two parts, and I say, have your hand reflect how this part feels or how heavy it is or whatever. And you're going to listen to them. They're going to tell you, why is this anger important? What is the job? What is the intent? And what is also the fear of happening if the other part wins? And both of those parts are going to be able to hear each other to try to understand each other. And it may bring about a compromise. It may not. It really depends on the person's system. But understanding the why, right? Like, why am I so angry versus like, why am I wanting to shy away from this? I have a really strong belief that, at least the way that I practice, I can't speak for everybody, and I'm not knocking any other theories. If we don't have awareness, the chances of growing and healing and developing and changing are lower. And if they're lower, then potentially what therapy acts as is a band-aid for something deeper. So let's use the anger as an
Mm.
example. If a therapist is like, well, let's only focus on coping with that anger, right? Because the therapist parts are saying, well, anger is also bad. They're in alignment there. So let's focus on coping. Well, then that person never gets to understand like why that part of them feels so strongly. And so the way that I would do it with a client is different. There's different IFS exercises, but it's all about getting to what I call, we're not talking about the symptom, we're going right to the source of the why. And I think when people can understand the why, that they can move about within themselves and the world a little bit better.
You said something really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Um, th- Therapy acts as a band-aid as something deeper.
Yeah, it
So
has the potential to. Yeah.
that snippet there, I'm curious if you could. I want to. Can you elaborate on that a little
Yeah.
bit?
Again, I'm not trying to knock specific or other therapists, other modalities. I know it works for me. I think that we, especially Western therapy, like very like normalized on white people, and then the field is very white and women and stuff like that. And like I'm white and all the things. We look at things from a societal standpoint of what we were taught was okay and versus what was not. And so I think boundaries is a really good example. People, I think, and there's a lot of like Instagram infographics, you know, I used to be the people pleaser and now I'm going to say no. And if you don't hear from me, it's because you're not checking in. And that's me taking control of my life. Because sometimes therapy says, well, you should be selfish. You shouldn't chase this person. You shouldn't blah, 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 blah. And I call it, and I talk about this with clients all the time, we don't want to overcorrect, right? And if we overcorrect, if someone's like, I'm going to say no to everything and I'm going to be selfish, what comes up for me is I love the South. I was not born in the South, but I'm really integrated in Southern culture. The idea of community. So I don't know if you remember, it was on TikTok, maybe last year or the year before. Should you take your friends to the airport when it's an inconvenience for you, right? If somebody is in therapy and they're told, be selfish, they're like, I'm not going to do this. Well, first off, you never maybe learned in therapy why you were people pleasing. Where did that come from for you? And why was it so ingrained in you for so long? And now you're just slapping another, well, not slapping, but you're overcorrecting. And that's the band aid is, I'm going to be selfish. But then when people are selfish, they lose that connection. And so I think when you tap in IFS therapy, when you're tapping in the self, I read it's like the most valuable resource we have in our self energy. When you're tapping in the self, one trait of self is feeling connected. And I think, especially from the South, I'm like, oh, connected to myself, my parts, but also connected to my partner's parts, connected to my best friend's parts and their systems and all of these things. And like that strengthens it. And I know when I have a really strong reaction to something that another, in my own personal life, another therapist and was like, well, you shouldn't worry about that. You should just move past that. You should be able to tell yourself from your 20 whatever year old brain that you should do this instead. And it's like, okay, well, let me try to relearn, but I wasn't ever learning why. So that's kind of, that was like a roundabout, long, yappy answer to your question. But
No, first of all, Yap is live.
yes,
Um,
certified yapper.
yeah. So okay, you bring up something that I love that is really interesting is this kind of like almost what I think of is what you're describing, and feel free to correct me like if you feel it's differently. This
Yeah.
like abusive therapy of this idea that selfishness at its core is well, I'm trying to be careful with my words.
Yeah. It's like
That
hard to talk about. So I get
yeah,
where you're,
well, I
I
also
get
don't want to get canceled, so I'm like
it. Yeah.
which I'm sure I've said something in the past that's cancelable, and I'm like, well, actually, can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah.
So it's interesting that I just mentioned that because I have clients that I've worked with, like in my internship, that have these amazing turnarounds. Like they come in and they have some idea. Like there are people that I've worked with for a year that have some ideas that they come up with, and just the growth that comes along with like recognizing, like, yeah, I used to hold this belief, and I don't hold that belief anymore.
Right.
Um, anyway, I don't know why that just came up. So, kind of circumventing back, yeah, where it's, we had these ideas of like, well, that's an inconvenience for me, so I'm going to be like,
Right.
selfish and set a boundary. And that is to your point, like, I don't believe that that's what a boundary is.
Right.
Avoiding
Yes.
discomfort
It's taking,
of any
I
way.
call it, you're taking control, which
Mhm.
is not always a bad thing. But and when you are constantly taking control and disguising it or believe it to be a boundary, that's not healthy.
Mhm.
That's actually going to push people away. Like it's the overcorrection. You were so used to people pleasing all the time and saying yes and doing all the things. Now you're overcorrecting because at the core of both of those, it's this belief of I don't matter. And so I'm responding to that by trying to do everything for everyone. But now I'm going to respond to that by doing nothing because I matter to me. I'll give an example for me, and this was came up in my training, especially like the polarization. I had a part that was like, don't spend money. Spending money is bad. Like bad things will happen if you spend money. You don't have enough money and something bad happens. And I had a part that was like, but you've worked hard. This is the first time in your life that you've had money. This was like a year into working. This is the most money that you've had. You've earned it, right? And at the crux of that, for me, I'm trying to remember, I think it was a fear of like, you're not going to have enough, right? Because if I don't go out and do these things and say yes to these things, then I'm missing out. But if I don't have money saved, then something's going to happen and I'm going to miss out or something bad's going to happen. So it's like,
Mhm.
that's kind of what I mean of like this overcorrection and this balancing versus I had a therapist, not IFS, who was like, she related to me. And so she was sharing her story and she was like, I grew up in poverty. And so now I have 15 pairs of jeans. And people are like, why do you have 15 pairs of jeans? She's like, because I can. And it's like, that is valid. That is 100% valid. A part is doing that. A part is saying, yes, we have the money to get jeans. But in parts work, I say there's a difference between a part having to do something and getting to do it. And that slight difference takes off pressure. And to
Mhm.
this day, I wonder, like, did that one part of you feel to feel like you were financially secure, financially safe, say you have to have 15 pairs of jeans?
Mhm.
So and that's kind of what I mean is like things sometimes therapy or the way that we cope is slapping a band-aid versus like an IFS therapy, you're going to the source and you're doing like you're healing a wound is what I call it.
Mhm. It's interesting. I want to like touch on something too.
Yeah.
I knew this conversation was going to be tangential. Like I knew that was going to happen.
Yeah, that's fine.
Um, and so I want to acknowledge that and bring that into the space.
Yeah.
But so it's interesting we talk about like boundaries, like extreme boundaries, and sometimes, and
Hmm.
kind of like when with these ideas, because I also think you mentioning the idea of Western and a lot of therapy, right, is created by white people. I feel like in my intro to psychology or my theories class or whatever, the
Yeah.
only like the only person who was not a white man was, I think, Karen Horney. I don't know if you did psychology undergrad, or
Yeah.
maybe there's an undergrad somewhere. But anyway, there was like one woman, I think. And so
Yeah.
when I think about,
Was she? Yeah. I won't. We don't need to do a lesson right now, but yes, I do remember being like, "There's one woman on this required teaching
mhm,
of stuff right now."
yeah, And so it's interesting, like talking about boundaries and saying I am and I'm not going to do things for people, because what's coming up for me is saying, it's almost kind of like it can be. I'm not saying that this is how it is, but I feel like
Yes.
it can be a privilege sometimes to say, okay, well, I'm going to cut this person off,
Wow, yeah. That's
or,
so true.
you know, and I'm coming from someone who there have been people in my life that I've had to say, we're terminating this relationship.
Yeah.
But I think that sometimes that can be an easy thing to say, especially when it comes to people who maybe it can be easier to say when there are certain resources that are available to you. You know, I'm thinking specifically of people that maybe have parents that are potentially abusive or potentially
Yeah.
toxic, that they do not have the ability to disconnect from, because there are resources that are being shared there as well.
Right.
So I don't know. That's kind of what was coming up for me talking about, you know, if you go into some therapy session, chat GPT therapy or whatever, and it's like, no, this person did this to you, you need to cut them off.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's kind of like a privileged point of view of saying, well, because you can cut them off, maybe that is.
Yeah. I think you're bringing up two things for me is, and I think this just relates somehow, but I'm not sure yet. But it's like I remember growing up queer and growing up on the internet and people being like closeted and their parents were horrible, but it's like they don't have the privilege of cutting them off. Even into college, it's like their parents are paying it. It's like, you know, so I'm relating this to that is what can be unhelpful about therapy. There are some therapists who just push their values onto their clients. And when the bulk of therapists are looking and raised the same way, that's not going to fit for everybody. And so that's what I love about IFS therapy is I'm almost never telling people what to do unless we're like in crisis or I'm like I really want you to try this because I think it would be helpful for your parts. I'm not telling people what to do. And I tell them, I trust yourself and I trust your system to figure it out. And then once they have that precious resource, they have that self energy and that awareness, it's like, okay, I may not have the privilege to leave my husband when I'm in an unhappy marriage, or I may not have the privilege to do this or this or this. It feels better knowing that I can be there for me and I'm doing what is truly best. And my parts can agree on that and know that I am doing the best because now there's all this internal dialogue of other parts like catching up with each other. Um, so yeah, I think it's like just I don't want to use the word dangerous, but I think like we've I won't use a blanket statement. I've heard horror stories of people being like, I went to therapy, I had this horrible negative experience, and I'll never go again. And it's like, right, I wish different for you. I don't blame you because I've actually had a negative therapy experience while I was in grad school. I, girl, I ran out of the office and I was like, what are they teaching you? What theory are you ascribing to that said that that was okay? So I think it just is like, yeah, I don't know if I have an endpoint with that, but that was what was coming up in response when you were naming that.
No, I love that. It's interesting you mentioned having a bad therapist, because it was so when I was like 19, I had my first panic attack.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started experiencing anxiety. I was, a lot of times panic is like panic about panic,
Yes.
so it's like a lot of my anxiety was like, I'm having anxiety and I'm going to have a panic attack at the fear that I may have a panic attack.
Yeah.
There
You
were all
work
these,
yourself up. Yeah,
yeah, I'm like, oh
exactly.
my God, what if it happens here? What if it happens that, anyway. So I started working with a psychiatrist and they recommended me going to therapy. So I went to this therapist who I think was an intern. I don't really remember, but I remember getting really frustrated with them because they kept, and this is no shade to worksheets, but like they kept, every time I would come in, they would say, okay, we're going to do this worksheet. And I
Right.
would try to explain to them this. I just felt so disconnected from them. I'm like, you're not listening to what I'm experiencing. You're just kind of putting this worksheet down and saying, let's do this breathing exercise and X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, you're not. Yeah, and I went maybe like for 3 or 4 sessions, and I didn't
Right.
think about that again until I got into grad school.
Right.
And when I was in grad school, I remember that coming up in a class, and I shared about that in a class, and there were a couple other students, like a couple of my my co-students that had similar experiences. But yeah, I was just so disconnected from like I think what I needed in that moment.
Yeah. She was trying to give you a band aid.
Yeah, I think so, and it was almost too formal. I'm
Right.
like, talk to me like I'm a human being, not like.
Right. I think we're entering an age in the profession where we are really realizing how strong the attachment is with the therapist, how corrective and healing that can be. They shouldn't be dependent on it. And we have to check our own counter transfer into our own parts. But there's something really healing about the attachment of that you have with your therapist for some people.
Mhm.
And yeah.
Yeah, I wanna touch on something too that you mentioned. You've been saying a lot like core self energy, core self energy.
Yes.
Can we talk about core self energy? Who is she?
Yeah. I love her. Yeah, IFS says it's like the true state of being. I think I mentioned that. I think in one of the books they talk about traits of self are seen in every major religion of enlightenment, and I just find that really interesting. Um, Self is just you without your parts, and I think I go back and forth on this of what is self energy versus what is self and all the things, but I'm gonna try to remember. There's like 8 C's: creativity, courage, confidence, compassion, curiosity, connectedness, calm, and maybe that was it. Slash, maybe there was one more. But it's just the way that we are meant to exist and share with our parts. And in IFS therapy, it's the healing thing. So I don't know if I read this. If I came up with it, I'm copywriting it, all of it. If I didn't, then I'm not stealing it at all.
Right.
Um, we don't break a bone and go, this is just how things are now, right? The body has the capacity to heal. We just need a little help. We get a cast.
Mhm.
But when we go through trauma or we're raised a certain way, we kind of just say, this is how it is. But self is the cast. Self is the alignment of being this best version of ourself and sharing that with parts of ourselves in a way that our system is not used to. And that's where like the trippiness comes in and stuff like that. And so I think, I was talking to another therapist today and we were talking about like the overlap of mindfulness and self compassion and their modality and self. And it's like, it's probably the same thing, but we just have different names for it.
So it's interesting what I'm gathering from kind of what you're sharing is that self is just this kind of energy that is in you that is non-judgmental, that
Yep.
is curious,
Mm-hmm.
that considers things. Basically, this energy that is not weighed by a lot of like protective factors, you know?
Yeah. It's almost like not weighed by the experience that we've had.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It makes me think of I remember my first couple of clients and then doing supervision. You know, of course, when you work with other people, things come up. And I think
Right.
for me, it was interesting when certain defenses of mine were triggered in session.
Yeah.
And
As the client or the
as
therapist?
the therapist,
Yeah.
and kind of, talking in supervision about what is triggering that. And it's interesting, therapy, the word curious has become like my number one word that I
Right.
never used 2 years ago. I never used that word.
Right. Yeah.
And now it's kind of, I feel like, and I correct me, but this is where I think I'm getting at when you're describing
Yeah.
self. It's kind of like, if a client says something that I might not like, instead of me becoming defensive and saying,
Right.
well, they shouldn't say that, core self energy says, I'm curious as to where that's coming from with them.
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
yeah. And just yeah.
Yeah. I don't think I named this. That is what I think sets IFS therapy apart in a lot of ways. Is yes, you are encouraging the client to tap into their self, but it asks slash requires slash encourages the therapist to be in self. Because I think I used this example the other day. If you were raised that intense emotion, like you had to caretake that, and then a client starts crying in session, that part is going to come up. And
Hmm.
it may be like, oh, it's okay. It'll be okay. Or we'll get through this. You'll get through this, which is not a bad thing to hear. And that's what I think. I even need that reminder sometimes myself is like, our parts aren't bad. A part doing what a part does is great. And the self energy being like, tell me where this is coming from. I find myself, and sometimes I get teary eyed even with clients. I'm like, I'm finding myself having so much compassion for what you're saying or what this part of you believes or what that young little one of you experienced. And it's just a different response. And that's like what some of the healing is, because depending on someone's story, their trauma, not everyone has access to self energy immediately. It's there. I have a client, her parts have said we've locked it away. If there are pipes that carry it, we've turned them off
Mm.
because they don't trust it, which is very, very common in certain types of trauma. It can happen. I don't want to say it's super common, but her parts being like, compassion is weakness. Why would we accept that from her, the client, versus me being like, well, I find myself really wondering, like, has anything that I've said to you felt like weakness? Because I'm asking you to give yourself, or I'm asking this part of you to receive, if you'll let it, the same thing that I'm giving you. And that's what sets, to me, what sets IFS therapy apart is that I'll say responsibility, because that's what IFS is based out of you and your self energy helping the client reach their own.
So this is interesting, kind of
Yeah.
talking about treating trauma with IFS. And
Yeah.
I know that you also have an EMDR certification that I want to shout out as well.
Yes.
But so with IFS, you know, when we're talking about an individual who is like particularly traumatized, or maybe there is like a particular event, you
Right.
know, that they experience that is really, you know, it's part of like,
Activating.
yeah,
Yeah.
activating for
Formative.
them. Great word. Love that word, activating. How do we use IFS to treat that?
Yeah.
What is that?
I think, I actually love working with, and I'm not big on diagnosis, but for being able to just talk about it, I love working with complex post traumatic stress disorder, um, which for anyone who is listening or will listen to this knows it's like the repeated exposure to trauma, especially in childhood, but it can happen really at any point in life. When someone has gone through, let's just say like child abuse, their system, their parts learned that there were certain things, and this is true in IFS, but I'm using this for this example, things to feel or do or say that are not okay. To feel those things or do those things or let yourself be vulnerable, it would be the worst outcome. So
Mm.
their part is working away from that. And I'm not huge into the borderline personality diagnosis or disorder diagnosis, but I'm going to use that diagnosis. Whereas a field learning, it's born of childhood trauma or attachment wounds, I call them. And everything that you see that's a symptom of that diagnosis is a part or a team of parts or several parts or whatever doing what it thinks is best. And so that's the same of trauma and stuff like that. I think if I have a good example, I have a client, he went through a lot of verbal abuse as a kid. And so in today's age, and I'm identifying all of this just for ethical sakes, he has this part of him that puts him down before all the time. Heavy, heavy, heavy stuff will not let him believe good things. And this part, once we got to learn about it, it was like, well, I do that because if I don't, he's going to start to believe in himself. And then the shame and pain and vulnerability of someone saying something bad about him will be way worse than what I am saying to him. Like, that's
Mm.
unbearable. This is preferred. Even if it has a negative side effect, it's what's going to be better. And using IFS to let go, and this is what it's based on, especially in trauma and EMDR as well, let go of that belief that was formed at 7, because that's just not true anymore. And it doesn't have to be true. And that's when I talk about the get to versus have to. And we live in a very traumatic world, the society, world, life, all the things. And in this example, doing that healing work with him and updating the brain and updating the system and all the things doesn't make it so he'll never be criticized again. But if he gets criticized again afterwards, it's going to be a lot more bearable and easy to work through. After having gone through the IFS steps, the healing steps, versus not, if that part was pushed away or band-aided away in other types of therapy and then he gets criticized, it's going to be the pain of the present bringing with exacerbated by the pain of the past too. which that part's like, see, I told you we should have never stopped doing this because you were unprepared.
Mm.
Um, and so that's true of trauma and the perception and reality of parts slash how the brain works when we're growing up if we undergo a trauma during childhood, which is where I love to work. So that's why I'm referencing that. But yeah.
Yeah, it's also it's like what's coming up for me when you talk about that is people who have a lot of these, like what you're saying. I think it's just like beliefs left over from childhood.
Yes, that we're formed.
That
Yeah.
maybe aren't as accurate anymore.
Right.
That we still function in a way that they are. So one of the things that's interesting is, like, I don't know why this is coming up for me, but I think about people who have, they're always coming in and saying, well, I always pick bad guys to date, for example,
Yes.
or
Yeah.
whoever, bad, whatever. I always date, this kind of guy, and it's just my type. I attract them, blah, 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 blah. And what's coming up when you say that for me is thinking, what patterns are you using from childhood that are maybe probably unconsciously attracting this kind of
Yes.
person? And what
Yeah.
parts of you are pushing away the kind of people that are not like that?
Yeah.
So when I say that, what's coming up for me is I'm thinking about working with like clients. I had a client who always picked the wrong guy, and she was like, they just, there's all this stuff. But when we looked at the behavior, and we weren't using necessarily IFS or parts work, but when we
Right.
looked at the behavior, I'm thinking about, I would say, what kind of things are not attractive to you? Or what kind of things, she got the ick really quick.
Yeah.
And that was the thing, is
Yeah.
I'm like, you're getting the ick. I'm like, the ick, I think, is something left over. And,
Yeah, girl.
she would say things like, um, just generally, she would say things like, he just chewed weird,
Yeah.
or like blah, blah,
Or
blah.
he's too nice.
He's too nice,
I'm like,
and I'm like,
where's that coming from, girl?
yeah.
Right.
And I would think it's interesting that with a guy that seems to be more healthy and stable in the area of what you say you want, he has all these icks that get activated. But the guy who is kind of like, a little toxic, that, okay, let me be honest, the guy that we all kind of like, whatever, like, little toxic, little whatever,
The
he's
red
the one that,
flag.
yeah, the red flag, he's the one that just pulls you in. And I'm curious
Yeah.
about, now that you're saying in parts work, like, what parts are being activated that are pushing, good guy away,
Yeah.
and what parts are being activated that are pulling this guy forward, that is creating this pattern
Right.
that is, I always pick the wrong guy.
I think, it, and that's the thing is I was taught that anything is possible in anyone's system. So when I talk with clients and we're, parts work is not something you do to them, it's something you do with them. Even if we're not going inward and turning inward, we're talking about the awareness of parts. I'll say, I'm curious if this is happening, but really it can be anything. And so I say all that to say, I read in one of the books that I did for my training examples similar to that. And it was like a guy who just kept dating these girls who weren't good for them. And the part that was seeking them out admitted, well, I'm trying to find someone that, reminds him slash us of mom to try to finally get that approval. And it's like, wow.
Mm.
And, there's tens, maybe hundreds of different ways of why that part was doing what it was doing. But it was, it always does go back somewhere, usually, of why we do what we do. There's, maybe a better way to say that is there is always a reason. And yeah,
I'm okay. So this is what's coming up for me now.
yeah.
I've said this is what's coming up for me like 10 times in this session. So this is what's coming up for me now
Oh,
is
so you just
think,
called this a session.
yeah, well, yeah, I guess. Yeah. You have to send me a bill. Um, and so what I'm thinking of now
Yeah.
is, kind of when people repeat patterns, how if you have this experience from childhood, and then you are in a relationship that is similar to that, or you are, in a work place that's similar to that, and
Yeah.
thinking about what you know. So what I'm thinking about now is what I know versus what I want, right? So like
Yeah. Like
what
what
I'm
would be
from,
good for me.
yeah, what I'm familiar with is, maybe this is made up. Like, my mom is really critical of me.
Right.
And so, but I don't like that, and I rebel against that. But then I work in a workplace that there's a boss that's very critical of me.
Yeah.
And I am dating a partner who is very critical of me. So, you know, and when I say that like sometimes I'm thinking of people who don't know that they're doing that, but also people that don't realize that there's a different way, that it doesn't have to be.
The get to versus the
Yeah,
have to.
because you said something earlier about like, oh, you're breaking your bone, and you're like, things just have to be this way.
Right.
Like what I'm thinking of is kind of, it's coming back to my experience in therapy too, of also thinking of things. Wait a minute, like things don't have to be this way.
Right.
So I don't know. Is there anything that is coming up for you or coming up with experiences where you're thinking of where you've had a client who has been in a similar pattern for a long time and then they step out of it and they're like, wait a minute, why was I in that pattern for so long?
Yeah.
I don't know if anything's coming up there. And that was
Yeah.
a lot to get there.
No,
But yeah.
I'm tracking. I've got the ADHD part, so I'm listening. Yeah, I mean, I see that, especially with heavy warning, I guess, childhood sexual assault survivors, of they learned and their parts learned how to survive for so long. And I had uh older guy, and he had had that experience, and we spent 3 or 4, it was like 3 sessions doing parts work. um I also was using EMDR as well, but it's bulk of parts work, and we were working with like a numbing part, and that part really came up when he was overwhelmed or a lot was going on, and this part would just numb everything in those moments. And on the fourth session, he came in, he's like, I've been crying a lot. I have been feeling my emotions more intensely, the whole range of it. People in my life are noting that I'm different. And I'm like, right, because that part no longer has to numb, first off, but two, that part wasn't numbing just one feeling in one situation. It was numbing everything a little bit. We don't get to selectively numb. Um, and now you're experiencing this human experience of
Mhm.
emotions. And it just was such a powerful shift of, oh, I, I can handle it now. Self can handle it. And if my parts can't, myself can be there and we can figure it out together. And that's such a, not to be cliche, such a powerful shift to see. It's like nothing else. And I think, yeah, it's just, I don't know if I have a good end to that. It just was very, very different in that awareness. And it wasn't the awareness in the moment, which I think is what you were asking. So I apologize. It was the awareness after of like, I'm crying to this kids movie. And it's like, yeah, dude, you had like, I'm making this up, 40% of your emotional capacity. And now you have 100. Like, of course you're going to be crying to Moana 2, I don't know.
Mhm.
Like, it just is such a shift sometimes when people, and sometimes they have the awareness after, before, during, whatever. But that's why I'm like, this awareness is going to be really powerful. That is what we need to move forward in this, or for you to really see this. Um,
I'm
yeah,
thinking also so when you're saying this numbing part,
yeah.
is there any correlation to that? And maybe you mentioned at the beginning working with substance use disorder
Oh, yeah.
and alcoholism and
Yeah.
addiction.
I mean, I was taught addiction is just a coping skill gone wrong, right?
Mhm.
I tell clients this thing really worked for you for about 5 minutes and then it stopped, but this part of you already was like, it works.
Mhm.
Um, I've had clients I don't like the word necessarily addicted. I think addicted is fine, so I'll just use that, but their addicted parts are the ones who facilitated the intense substance use. We're getting through it. This is the way to get through social anxiety. This is the way to get through grief. This is the way that we get through emotions, because emotions are bad. And so we just got to move forward. Like that is like so. And I also have to say we live in a society. Our brains read and watch and see more trauma slash harm than I always think to back or Little House on the Prairie, because my mom had me watching that growing up. They knew the same like 100 people probably their whole life, and they knew who died, and if someone died 4 towns over they never knew. But then we have news and TV shows and crime podcasts and all of these things that we consume so much on a daily basis, we have to numb. If we felt
Mhm.
everything, if we felt grief or emotion towards all of that, we wouldn't be able to get things done. And so I balance personally. I have to let myself feel this a little bit so I can help or put money towards this or go and march or do whatever rather than just check out, because that's what society has and capitalism has encouraged us to do at this point in
Yeah.
society.
Yeah, our world is so much more activating
Yes.
than it's, like, ever been
Yes.
before, and yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about it in that way of, like, because sometimes I think I'm like, the feelings a lot of the feelings that we have and I sometimes I just think, how did people, before therapy and really mental health even
Yeah.
how did they cope and how did they manage X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
And I don't know, they were also probably experiencing a lot less stimuli than we were, but
Yeah,
anyway.
they didn't have this, they didn't have the TVs.
Mm-mm.
They were in the moment, and it was they let themselves feel, and then they got through that. I mean, not to say that they didn't need therapy, because I'm sure
Oh, yeah.
homegirl on Little House on the Prairie who went blind one season probably needed therapy, but you know,
Mhm.
we live in a world that encourages us to numb or distract.
Yeah, and we do it in so many ways.
Mm,
So I wanna bring up something. I wanna be conscious of time, but I also wanna bring
yeah.
up, how if someone was thinking, if someone's like this part stuff, what's going on with this part stuff? How can they, like, access their parts independently? How does somebody kind of get in touch with
That's
different
such
parts of
a
themselves?
yeah. Sorry, I did not mean to talk over you. I'm just
Please
thinking that
do.
question.
I talk
No,
too much.
that's a great question. I think for the first exposure, maybe just like trying to listen to yourself. My favorite question that I tell clients to start paying attention to and asking themselves that really helps know when we're blended, which we always have all these parts working, but blended specifically, which is when one part's super front and center, it's driving, it's got the spotlight and the mic. I ask my clients, when that was happening, when you felt that anger, when you felt this rejection, blah, 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 how old did you feel in that moment? And if it's coming from a young part locked away, there's always an answer. Even I've had a client be like, I just got so mad in that moment. He was making me feel stupid. I was like, right, how old did you feel in that moment? And they're like, oh, that's touching, that touched up on their school trauma and their neurodivergency growing up and stuff like that. And so I think just like trying to ask yourself the why and try to ask yourself, how old am I feeling? Do I feel like I can have this internal dialogue? I also think that there are IFS meditations. No Bad Parts is great as the first introduction, especially the audiobook, because it's like narrated by someone whose name I don't know, but then Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, he narrates the like exercises and the slight meditations throughout. And I was driving, listening to it one day, all before my training, and he's like coming on. He's like, what does this part want you to know? And I'm like, I can't do this right now. I'm going to crash my car and drive. So don't listen to it while you're driving, because
Yeah.
it's like not meant for that.
Mhm.
But I think it's just about listening to ourselves. And I think a lot of therapies are in this day and age about that. Like, don't know a lot about somatic experiencing, but I think it's about listening to your body in a way that we haven't before. Mindfulness is listening to ourselves and be like, what comes up for me in this moment? And I think that's hard for people because, you know, I always hear the response. I don't suggest meditation, but when we're talking about self care and all these things, a lot of people are like, it was uncomfortable to sit in silence that long. It's like, right, what was coming up for you that where you're like, oh, I'm not going to do this. So I think it's about, you said your favorite word earlier. One of mine is like intention. So it's about being
Mhm.
intentional and listening to ourselves and saying, why do I feel this way? And I've done the work, and I'm not perfect with my system in any way, shape, or form. But and I use this example with my clients. Long story short, had to call the sheriff's office to ask to use a parking lot because our HOA said no street parking. And I was like, I do not want to do this. I was like, I would rather just not call and not have the party and do this. And my friend was like, why? And I
Mm.
was like, why do I feel like that? And immediately it was, oh, there is this part of me, it feels young, that feels like I'm going to get in trouble for asking for permission. And so just asking yourself why in that moment. And I'll say, once I realized that part stepped to the side and I was able to I had to call 3 different people, all without issue. And
Mhm.
so I think it's just about rather, and this is, I think, a lot of sometimes what Western counseling also encourages is rather than looking at this person, rather looking at your partner, rather looking at your parents and what was going on in that interaction with them, look inside, be like, what was going on for me in that moment? Um, I'm reading an IFS couples book right now because I've dipped my toe into couples, and it's kind of jarring because it's basically it is not your partner's responsibility to walk around your wounds. And I think there's a
Mhm.
little bit of flexibility there of you can regulate together and you can be mindful. But if you, as a kid, were criticized, so now you have this part that never wants to be criticized, it's not feasible for your partner to never give you feedback or never say, hey, this hurt me, and that's going to activate that for you. So being like, why do I feel so strongly in this moment that they're criticizing me and that I'm being critiqued? I think there's worth and value in that of us listening to ourselves. That was a very long way to answer your question, but I think it's a very simple at the crux of it is just starting to try to listen to ourselves. Because I've had people who came in and had no idea what IFS therapy was. Very, like you said, a lot of people are doing it and don't know. Being like, well, what does this part of you want you to know in that moment? What is this part trying to accomplish? And they're like, yeah, I mean, I'm getting angry because I don't like to feel, like I'm in trouble. It's like, right.
Mhm.
Um, so
Yeah.
I hope that answers that question.
No, I think it was great. It's interesting. I like talk to myself a lot. So I mean, I have full on conversations. Like,
Your parts
yeah. I mean,
or
it's
your parts with
interesting.
each other.
Yeah, this might sound kind of kooky, but I walk my dog a lot, and I will put headphones in, and most of the time I'm talking to a friend, but sometimes I'm genuinely dialoguing with myself about if
Uh,
I do that, then that would go here. But no one wants to do that. So I do that all the time.
yeah.
Um,
People do that all the time because, I mean, it's
mhm.
in movies and people just will use that. A part of me feels this way and a part of me feels that way. It's like, right. You're so, you got it.
Mhm.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
and I tell people I've had a friend when I explained it to her, she goes, I don't think that would work for me because I'm just so singular minded. And I was like, you've never been internally conflicted? Because that's what internal conflict is.
Mhm.
Those parts being like, do we do this or that? Or should we, I want to do that, but we should do that. That's your parts. And so I love that
Mhm.
for you. Just like putting your headphones in and having that dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I personally do it all the time, and I've encouraged clients to do it. I'm like, talk to them. What do they want?
Yeah. I might,
Um,
I might steal that.
yeah, I had one guy who would literally he could dialogue with me, but and I was basically facilitating. You
Right.
know,
Like his
he,
parts and all that.
yeah, and
Yeah.
he would say he would be like, I don't remember what the issue was, but he would be like, yeah, and I feel this way, and I would say, yeah, but this part of you feels that way. What does that part have to say?
Yeah.
And he would say, so, and he would just immediately switch, and he would be
Yeah.
like, so I don't think that that's gonna work. And then he would,
Yeah.
and I told him, I was like, dude, just put your headphones in when you're walking on the street and like pretend you're on the phone.
Yeah.
Nobody knows.
Come on, brother.
Yeah, I mean, it's,
I really love that. And I think what you're encouraging in that specific example and what IFS gives permission is that we don't have to feel 100% one way. And that's been a really big shift because, especially like, let's use addictions work. It's like they would like to say, especially when they're in crisis and they know that it's not this good thing anymore, all of me really thinks I should stop. And it's like, well, not all of you. There's a part of you that doesn't.
yeah.
And my therapist told me this once just because all of your parts know one thing or have healed from this one thing doesn't mean that all of you has. And that was such an eye opener. And I repeat that phrase with clients of,
Hmm.
especially when you're working with trauma from childhood, it's like, I thought I was past this. It's like, right, a lot of you has healed and moved forward. And you should have that appreciation. It doesn't mean that all of you has had the opportunity. Why don't we give that part that opportunity?
Yeah, it's interesting too because now that I'm thinking about it, there's been several times with clients where I've been like, I've just mentioned, it's interesting that logically you're aware
Yep.
of this information, but emotionally you're not responding in that way.
Right. Yes.
So, you know, a
Yeah.
lot of times with anxiety too.
Intellectualization is a very
Hmm.
protective part that most people have.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm like, you're
Yeah.
telling me something that I think that you believe intellectually, yeah, but
Yeah.
your body doesn't feel that way.
Right.
So yeah, and
What's
it's
the
anyway.
truth?
Yeah, what's the truth? And is there like is there like a
Yeah.
50-50? What's going on there?
Yep.
Um, I want to ask you one final question.
Yes.
Basically, first of all, thank you so much for coming on and
Yeah, thank
chatting.
you for inviting
And
me. My
of
parts are
course,
like, parts of me are like, you're not official enough for this. And then the other part of me is like, you kind of are. So
yes,
this
you
has been
are.
great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no, you are. And I want to give a shout out to your partner, Matt,
Yeah,
because he is who I met. We went to the Sweat Tour,
right,
um, probably XCX and Troye Sivan.
right.
I went with a group of friends and he was there and I met him there. And I remember
Yeah,
I was in grad school and obviously, yeah, I've been in school forever.
yeah,
So, yeah, this was like last year. And then I said, oh, I'm doing therapy. He's like, oh, my boyfriend's doing therapy. And then, yeah, and then I saw something about IFS and I'm like, whoa, 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 okay, hold on.
yeah.
Who is this? I
It
need to
was,
know this
it was
person.
me.
And it was you. It was me.
Yeah,
But yeah, so quick like little shout out to him. He was so sweet. And he honestly, it's so funny. He does similar to what I do when I go out, where
yeah,
he's like so at least this is my impression. I mean, I was there just that one night. He's so like, look, we can do whatever. We're gonna have fun. I'm just here to have a good time.
yeah.
And especially in groups where it's a lot of like gay people.
Going to
you know,
Sweat Tour, no less.
right, right.
I
There's
think
all
I
these
came from work to go. Like I met him. I was there with him, but I
oh,
like
were you?
met him up there. Yeah. But anyway,
Oh, wow. Well, because we went out after, and then, there's so many personalities that are coming out, and he was just very down with the flow. And I'm
yeah,
kind of similar in that way. Well, I can be kind of loud. Anyway, let's not, I can start there. Anyway, just shout out to him
Matthew.
for going. But yeah, so quick final question. Is there any piece of advice that you've gotten that you feel like
Mm,
that was really good advice, or anything, any sentence or whatever that you heard that you're like, I
yeah.
want to hold on to that one?
As like a therapist,
Sure.
I
As a
think.
person,
Oh, as a
therapist.
person too. Yeah, as a person, I think it's just like not all of you is on the same page, and I think that's the permission. Because Matt, I describe Matt as like the moon. He's very chill. He's just there, and I'm like the sun. I'm like "Ah," all the time. So I will be mad about parking for 20 minutes. So,
Mhm.
um, yeah, just that permission to let yourself feel and feel it all, and give it that recognition. There's no point in trying to stuff it down because it's gonna be there. Um, as a therapist, I heard this from my lead trainer in my IFS training. We move at the speed of trust. And I tell clients that in their intake. We move at the speed of trust. And they always think, oh, my trust in you, my trust in this process. And it's like, yes. But it's also your parts trust in you, in your self energy, because parts work is very permissions based. And so just honor, like moving. So, all of that to say, the advice is just kind of sit in the flow. Like in private practice, it's different than other certain environments, but I think this can ring a level of true no matter what. As long as you continue to choose to see me, we have time.
That's so
Yeah.
sweet.
And it's like, and that's true. Like I have many people's parts are like, well, I just want to get over this and this part's not ready. It's like, we have time. It's okay.
Mhm.
We wouldn't go somewhere when I'm talking to a part. We wouldn't go there if you weren't okay with it. So we're not going to go there because that part's not okay with it.
Mhm.
And I used to be slow out of fear of making a mistake. And then I learned one, I've trusted myself and done the training. So I'm like, okay, I think I'm good at this. I trusted myself. But also, I just find that sitting in the slow works for a lot of people. And it can take time. Like, it's not, therapy takes time. There is no timeline. Um,
Mhm.
and people will ask, and it's like, yeah, girl, I don't know. Could be 3 months, could be 3 years, really. And when people sit in the slow and feel that calmness, it's a relief because then they can access that calmness outside of session. And if slowness is activating for them, then we've got a point to focus on, which is also helpful to know. So I think that, hustle culture and grind culture is like huge right now, which my
Mhm.
partner like, ugh. Um, and there are times when I'm like, go, 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 go in my day or my life, but it's also like, let me just kind of sit with that and think on that. And I think, just being able to say, yeah, I'm just really kind of letting that sink in for me. Let's kind of sit with that. As a
Mhm.
therapist, people gain benefit out of that. So
Yeah, I love that. And I feel like I want to sit in the slow now too.
yeah.
Yeah, just take a moment. Thank you so much, so much for coming
Yeah.
on.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I think I think I think there no bad parts might be up here somewhere.
Real? Awesome.
I don't know. It's somewhere in
I didn't
here.
read it, which I'm not supposed to say, but I started reading it and then I got into my training and I was like, let me just read the book for therapists. And I put on my application that I had read it, but anyway.
Can I say something
Yeah.
before we go? I wasn't a huge fan of the book.
I
I
think it's
loved
great for
everything
like
else.
the average person.
Yeah.
Not average, just not therapists.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But that's the tea on that.
that is.
Anyway, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank
Thank you.
you.